Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I thought I would have a very real and chill and honest conversation about an experience that I had very recently, which is that I did not get into a Master of Clinical Psychology program. So I just want to flag that as of right now, all of my clinical psychology applications were rejected except for one. I am still waiting on one, but the odds are very much stacked against me in terms of number of applications, other applicants maybe experience. You know, at the end of the day, it is a very competitive field. It's competitive for a purpose. So yes, I am waiting on one last application, and I will talk about that if I actually get it. But as of right now, I'm not enrolled in a clinical psychology program, and I was rejected by all but one universities that I applied for. I know that when a lot of people are in their 3-year psychology undergraduate degree, they catch wind of the clinical psych masters and they sort of lock onto it, and then they all strive for that. Every psychology student wants to get into a clinical degree. And I just wanted to come on here and actually talk about what happens when you don't. And I want to make very clear that it's not the end of the world. So for starters, I want to make very clear that when I went into studying psychology, my passion was to become a psychologist. I didn't specify what type of psychologist. I just knew I wanted to be in a position to provide one-to-one counseling, being able to use scientifically proven techniques to aid and help people to better their lives and better control the conditions they were dealing with. Now, that's all I was originally wanting, and I knew that's what I wanted. As you go through your 3-year undergraduate degree, however, things become a little bit more competitive. You start hearing how everyone's competing and, oh, it's so hard to get into the clinical program. Everyone wants to get into the clinical program. So you lock onto that, or at least I did. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. That's my first choice. I want to be a clinical psychologist. Now, you sort of lose sight a little bit then, I guess, of why you originally did want to enroll in the degree. And for those who don't know, clinical psychology is not the only master's degree that allows you to be a practicing psychologist in Australia. You also can complete a Master of Professional Psychology. So what that means is that if you do the Master of Professional Psychology, you can become a general registered psychologist, but it means you can't get endorsed as a clinical psychologist. Not unless you do some type of bridging year, like little extra degree to make up for it, which apparently they in themselves are quite rare and hard to get into. I know though that if you complete a professional psychology degree, you can actually apply to still get into a clinical degree with prior recognition of learning. But I would imagine that that is also very competitive. So a lot of people's goal is to just go straight into clinical psychology, and that's what the narrative sort of becomes about. So a little bit of a hierarchy gets created where it's like, okay, you have the Master of Professional Psychology degree, which at my university, there are actually around 45 to 60 spots. And then there's the clinical degree, which has grown from 10 to 15 to 20 spots. So the clinical degree is actually growing as well in terms of how many people they allow. But because there's less spots in clinical, there's a hierarchy where it's like, oh no, clinical's the best. You want to be a clinical psychologist. And you get very caught up in that, and then that adds pressure. And you know, there's a little bit of a stigma there then of like, oh, well, you didn't get into clinical, oh, she's doing professional and all of that stuff. So I actually got into Master of Professional Psychology. I got my acceptance into that program on the very last day of honors, which was amazing because it's like, wow, I'm finishing honors and I already know that I'm going to become a psychologist. But because I was waiting to hear from my clinical application, I had delayed accepting that conditional offer, and I really stretched it out right until the last day. Just so you know, a conditional offer in my case was that I just needed to actually get my final grades, which I knew I had already met the requirements. So I knew I was in. I just had to accept the conditional to receive the full offer to enroll, and that's it. I would be set. But because I left it right to the last minute, I'm an anxious person, and I had a little bit of a feeling of, oh my goodness, I have waited it out to get into clinical, which I did not get into. What if I've waited too long and my spot's gone and been given to somebody else? That little experience made me realize how silly it is to drum up one degree and not realize that the other degree is basically offering the exact same thing. It just does not have the title of clinical psychology. Because for a moment, I thought I wasn't going to get into this degree, which by the way, people that I know did not even get into, and they actually had decent grades and they were capable of, you know, speaking and whatnot. So I realized, whoa, priorities. And then yeah, I enrolled in professional psychology, and I was like, oh my god, phew, like I secured the fact that I'm going to become a psychologist, which is super, super exciting. Now, that is something that I think is really important. In life, human beings create hierarchies with everything, different jobs, different degrees, different universities where you attain those degrees. And you really do have to take a step back and analyze how legit these hierarchies actually are. Now, I know that in 4th year, a lot of students started to catch on to the fact that teachers could not differentiate between a clinical and a general psychologist. So, you know, it was just becoming this case of like, what is the difference? Why is one more prestigious than the other? Is there really a big deal in not going into clinical psychology? To make it really simplified, from what we all gathered, the difference is, first of all, the title. The second difference is the Medicare rebates. Clinical psychologists do earn more through Medicare rebates than a general psychologist. But even a clinical psychologist said to us, we do the exact same job. I know that for clinical psychologists, there are more opportunities to go into research, I believe, and teaching, but a general psychologist can actually pursue a PhD to catch up and do the exact same thing. So it was just like starting to put things, like in my head I was like, okay, I know like I was striving for clinical psychology, but throughout the year I did start to question whether I should, you know, really beat myself up if I didn't get into clinical and I did get into professional. So, you know, just a little bit more of like the less competitive side of things and just trying to look at it from straight facts and logic. We all know that everybody wants the prestige title of clinical, but does that really mean that you should throw away 4 years worth of hard work and excitement for your future just because you might not get that title of clinical psychologist? And I started to realize, look, maybe, you know, it's not all it's cracked up to be in terms of, you know, I thought there'd be more differences. As long as I could have my one-on-one counseling sessions, as long as I could, you know, have the opportunity to become particularly trained in different forms of psychotherapy, such as acceptance and commitment therapy, would I really care if I, you know, went home from a day in my office doing all that and was like, oh, but I'm not a clinical psychologist? And I started to realize maybe not. I guess it's just another form of being sold this idea, and then you start to realize that the idea isn't as glamorous or meaningful as you were led to believe. And then you have to go back to the original plan, which is to become a psychologist. So I, towards applications, was very much getting re-caught up in being like, nah, I want clinical, I want to get into clinical. I didn't. But I'm still becoming a psychologist. So it was just about what do I actually want to do? Did I get into this for a title, or did I get into this to do pretty much the exact same job as a clinical psych, which is to be a general psych? I just want people, if you're going through honors year in particular, because this is when you really start to think about it, try to analyze whether you are chasing a goal or whether you are getting caught in a narrative, a competitive narrative. There were a lot of moments too where I was like, okay, I have a really good shot at getting into clinical psych remember how I said I'm waiting on one final application? I think I actually do have a solid chance with that particular university. And I was like, okay, I might get into that. And do I want to actually still pursue a clinical degree? Because a clinical degree is 2 years, not 1, which means that you have to do a thesis. And in your second year, you have to write another thesis. And I'm just like, Brooke, is that really what you want to do? Do you want to execute another experiment? Do you want to go through all that? And hey, I'm a huge believer in no pain, no gain. So I actually do think, like, for those of you who did do a clinical degree and did do the second thesis, props to you, like I totally get it. But for me, I was like, ugh, I'm kind of like trying to weigh that up. So I still have to ask myself, if there was no hierarchy and if there was no such thing as other people judging like the degrees, and I got into clinical, would I actually take it, or would I just be satisfied with the fact that I was offered a spot? And that is something I haven't crossed that road yet because I don't have the outcome of that application. But just to be very raw and real with you, those are the thoughts that I've been having. And I think it's also good, you know, some people might say like, oh, but you're only thinking like that because you don't know if you got in, you probably didn't get in, and you didn't get into clinical. But sometimes when like as a psych student, not getting into clinical seemed like the worst thing ever. And then when that starts to actually happen, it means that you start to have to look at it from a different perspective. And sometimes that perspective can be a little bit more logical and rational. Like, I was shocked. There was one application where I really did want that clinical spot. And I got the email saying, you know, we're sorry, but it was highly competitive. You didn't, at this time, we can't make you an offer, blah, blah. My mother thought I was going to cry, like, but I didn't, because I was like, okay, I didn't get in. But, and this is my next point, make sure if you are aiming for clinical, please do your absolute best throughout the 4 years. I am at a point, and I think this is something that I just went through the motions as well. I genuinely look back at my 4 years and I do not believe there is anything more I could have done to prepare for the clinical applications. I put blood, sweat, and tears into every assignment that I was given. I studied so hard for every exam that I took. I went out and yes, there could have been room for more volunteer work earlier on, but I was active in doing volunteer work that was directly related to mental health. I literally cannot express to you that I genuinely was very proactive in preparing myself to get into clinical psychology. My honors supervisor was shocked. He was really confident, to be honest with you, that I was going to get multiple clinical offers. His PhD students were shocked. And that's not me being like gloating and being like, oh, I'm awesome, I should have got given a spot. I'm actually saying to you that I'm not just sitting here being like somewhat delusional, being like, oh no, I did everything and it's everyone else's fault and blah, blah, blah. I had external academics also being like, Brooke, you're not gonna have a problem getting in. And they were familiar with my work, they were familiar with how I present myself, how I talk, my abilities and whatnot. So there's a little bit of relief in that I can't look back at my last 4 years and be like, you know what, you blew it. Like you should have paid attention in that class. I was the student, I watched every lecture. I didn't watch every lecture just once, I watched them twice, sometimes 3 times. I didn't just type notes, I hand wrote notes. I literally would talk like with my family members about course content. I would exchange ideas. I would like throw myself into my work. So, and not only that, like I just said, because obviously in psychology it is not just theoretical book work, it's also human interactions, like what's your social ability. So I made sure to cover that as well. In my second year in my undergraduate degree, I deliberately sought out a volunteering position in order to test whether or not I would be suitable for counseling work. This is how much I prepared, this is how much I wanted to make sure I wasn't wasting my time, other people's time. So in saying all that, I'm very confident in how hard I worked during those 4 years. Clinical, it would appear, is very competitive, and I'm obviously going up against people who are a lot older than me and actually have had a lot more experience than me. Every university, you know, they value different things with masters, whether it's grades, related experience, or your ability in the interviews. So yeah, for me, you rip the band-aid off, you find out you haven't gotten in, but I was just like, well, you know what? I really did give it my best, and that's okay. Like, there is a truth in that. You can't be regretful if you did absolutely everything you could. The main takeaways from this video is that I did not get into clinical, which was, I guess, the worst nightmare as a psych student. And it was okay, I survived. It wasn't even as bad, like emotionally it wasn't even as bad as I thought it would be. And that's probably because I did get into the professional master's degree. So I already knew, like I knew I was becoming a psychologist. I knew I wasn't left with no options. And I also respect that not everybody got into that professional degree, and that at the end of the day, psychology is competitive, and it's competitive whether you're doing the professional degree, whether you're doing the clinical degree. I also am quite, you know, mature enough to understand that it's not the degree that's going to make your career, it's you. The effort that you put into professional development, etc., is what is going to actually matter and make a difference. So it's just about becoming a bit more of a mature individual, not getting caught up in competitions and hierarchies. Again, I'm someone, like I said, I left school, I actually did a TAFE course. TAFE is slandered beyond the hills in terms of these like educational hierarchies. I had an awesome time at TAFE. Like, those teachers were so dedicated. I met some really lovely people. I'm not about hierarchies, but even I started to get sucked into one. So I just want you guys to be so aware of that. And there are people who, there would be reasons they definitely want to be a clinical psychologist. I think if you're really into research, you definitely want to do the clinical program. So that's just about reflect what you're after, reflect what you're really looking for. And the gateway is still open for me after the professional degree, where if I still want to pursue clinical, I really can. Like, it's still competitive, it's still not guaranteed, but it's not the end of the road. If I really do want that extra year, I can still apply for it, do the interviews again, and see what happens. This was just my experience with actually getting knocked back from all my clinical applications. Even though I didn't get in, I'm still open to making another video where I will give advice for, you know, preparing for master applications, going through master applications, looking at the different master courses. Even though you don't get in, you still obviously go through the process and there are things you learn along the way. So I'd be very happy to sort of dive a bit deeper in the actual process itself as opposed to the outcome. But yeah, that was just my experience, and you know, good luck to those of you who are starting either the clinical or professional degrees this year. Absolutely amazing achievements. Be so proud of yourself. It is a long road. Like, we're up to year 5, people. 5 years of university study. Whew, we'll get there. If you haven't already, be sure to hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, tell me where you're at on your journey, how you're feeling, what your thoughts are, and also give this video a thumbs up if you did enjoy it. And I will see you in the next video. Bye!